Hello everyone, this is Duan. Today I would like to share with you some of the new features that are coming in the React version 18. Let's get started. So React 18 comes with a bunch of new features, so things like automatic batching, which makes the front-end development a bit more consistent, the start transition API, which helps the UI becomes more responsive, and also we have the HTML streaming, selective hydration. Those are based on the suspense server-side rendering architecture, which will help the performance of the application by quite a bit. I am personally super excited about the new features. I hope you are as well. Let's talk about each feature in a little bit more detail. To start, the automatic batching in React 18 is made to be more consistent. To understand what batching means, in React, a UI will be re-rendered after each update, but in scenarios where an event could trigger multiple updates, instead of re-rendering the UI multiple times, it will automatically batch the updates together into one single update, and React only need to re-render the UI once after that. So the less re-rendering means a better performance for your application. Before React 18, the automatic batching only works for React event handlers. So things like onClick, onSubmit. It doesn't work for promises, set timeout, native event handlers, but now with the update, the automatic batching works for any event. So in this example with the set timeout, the two state update will re-render once in React 18. So in cases you want to have re-render after each update, you can use the flush sync to wrap the state update function to make the React re-render. Next, we also have a new API. It's called the Start Transition API, which makes the UI much more responsive by actually distinguishing updates into two different categories, the urgent update and the transition update. The urgent update is something like a keystroke or a button click or something like an input change that requires an immediate update. For transition update, it's basically UI update. So for example, if you're rendering a list of items depending on the input, you're filtering through that list, and the list could look a lot more different when your input is different. The Start Transition API is able to do this because it marks the update as a transition update. Once a state is marked as a transition update, it can be interrupted by other urgent update. Once an update is being interrupted, the React will not waste any time rendering the current process. It will start immediately on the latest update only, which is the content that's most relevant to the user. So traditionally, we use set timeout for a similar functionality, but the Start Transition API has several advantage or benefits. First of all, it doesn't have any delay to it. So set timeout, usually you do have some delays, but the Start Transition always renders your component immediately whenever possible. And the fact that it's also interruptible makes the UI more responsive because while the UI is rendering, the UI elements are not interactive. So the fact that it can interrupt the rendering process means that any urgent update come in will be very interactive. And lastly, they also introduced the use transition hook, which you're able to take advantage of if you want to render some fallback component because it does provide this ending state if you want to use it. Next, we have HTML streaming. HTML streaming alongside with selective hydration both uses the suspense server-side rendering architecture. So basically what suspense SSR architecture is that you wrap some component inside of a suspense and provide it with a fallback component. So typically in a page, you have a primary component which displays the critical information the user wants to see first, and some secondary components such as reviews, comments, which the user tend not to see first. So what the traditional SSR does is that the server will contact the data source and fetch all the data from the data source for all the components on the page and before actually generating the HTML for the client. So the downside of this approach is that the client might take a while to see anything on the page because some component might take longer to fetch the data and the server has to wait for that to complete. In React 18, it does the server-side rendering a little bit differently. So basically, the server still contacts the data source to fetch the data, and sometimes you have component that takes longer to fetch the data source. And usually the server has to wait for that to send HTML to the client. But with the suspense SSR architecture, the server doesn't actually need to wait for all the components to get the data to be able to send HTML to the client. It will send the primary component with the fallback for the secondary component to the client. So the client is able to quickly look at the primary component while the secondary component fetches the data from the data source. Once that's complete, the secondary data will be sent to the client and replace the fallback component. And with this approach, it's faster for clients to see what's on the page and is extremely user-friendly. So the traditional hydration process in the server-side rendering also have several flaws. For example, in a page, you have a primary component and the secondary component similar to the previous one. Before React 18, what it does is the page will load all the components all together before hydrating. And once it's loaded, it will hydrate all the components all at once, and then the page becomes interactive. And if some component it takes longer to load or takes longer to hydrate, it will make the page feel uninteractive for a period of time. So the selective hydration solved this problem by prioritizing hydration on components that it's able to hydrate and also component that user wants to interact with. So for example, in this component, because the secondary component has not been sent from the server, it will prioritize hydrating the primary component first without waiting for the second component. Once it's been hydrated, it's made to be interactive as soon as possible so the user can interact with the primary component. And once the secondary component is received from the server, it will replace the fallback component and it will hydrate immediately. And once it's hydrated, it will become interactive as well. So the page becomes interactive much faster than the traditional approach. And in addition to that, if a multiple component is being hydrated, the selective hydration will prioritize the component that user wants to interact with. React will do this by listening to event on the component. Once the event is being received, it will recognize which component user wants to interact and hydrate that component as soon as possible. As a result, the new features in React 18 such as automatic batching allows React to have optimized and consistent rendering process, and the ability to interrupt rendering process enabled by the Start Transition API help the pages become more responsive. And lastly, the HTML streaming and the selective hydration improves upon the existing server-side rendering architecture and make the page become interactive much faster. And that's everything you need to know about what's coming in React 18. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment below. If you do enjoy the video and would like to see more related content, please consider like and subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.